Silence is violence! Silence is violence! Silence is... Asian is not a virus! Asian is not a virus! Asian is not a virus!
Your attacks of terrorism are not a bad day. They are an attack on my culture. Your acts of aggression against our elders are not coincidence. They are hate crimes. I want to live through a time where we refuse the divisive tactics of white supremacy. I want to look into a brighter future where all people of color can stand as one against the real enemy, racism. We stand with the Asian community! We stand with Asians!
Speak up and tell our own stories of discrimination and racism. I was afraid that something would happen to my family if I spoke up. For too long, the everyday discrimination many of us have faced has seldom been talked about until now.
When Asian elders are under attack, what do you do? When Asian elders are under attack, what do you do? When Asian elders are under attack, what do you do?
Thank you to Desmond O'Shea and Yoram Savion and Destiny Arts Center for making that video and giving us permission to include it today. It was filmed last month after the Atlanta shootings, and it depicts a Bay Area youth-led march against Asian hate that flooded the streets of Oakland. High schoolers Lucia Morantanos Chu and Abby Lamoureux organized students to march from City Hall through downtown in Chinatown to Lake Merritt for a gathering and vigil. In the video, we saw multiracial solidarity and representation among youth, generations, and high schools. Lucia tells us, quote, we organized this march because anti-Asian racism in this country has often been overlooked and ignored. We believe in the fight against racial injustice, but it's up to all of us. Together, we are stronger. Right on, Lucia. Welcome to the 7th edition of Rise Up for Justice, Black Lives and Our Collective Future, a series of live stream discussions on the movements for racial justice and belonging. My name is Gerald Lenoir, and I'm the strategy analyst at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, the sponsor of this event. George Floyd's murder by Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin ignited a firestorm of protests across cities and small towns throughout the US and globally. A movement led by Black Lives Matter demanding police accountability and justice has galvanized multiracial anger and frustration over repeated killings of Black men and women. This pivotal uprising has already begun to reshape our relationship with Black lives and is having profound implications for our collective future. For today's event, our sub-theme is Beyond Solidarity, Bridging the Black-Asian Divide. May is a significant month to hold this dialogue on Black-Asian relations. 2 days ago, we commemorated the year anniversary of the brutal murder of George Floyd. We're also commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And May is also the month when we celebrate Asian Pacific American heritage, in which we acknowledge the contributions and the struggles of all of the diverse communities that we call Asian and Pacific Islander. Finally, on May 19th, we celebrated the birthdays of two of our revered ancestors. I'm talking about Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama, an African-American man and a Japanese-American woman who not only shared the same birthday, but also shared a close friendship and a deep commitment to the struggle for racial justice. So the backdrop for our conversations is the historical and contemporary racial narratives in the US that denigrate and dehumanize all people of color while promoting a narrative of white supremacy. It is the structural and ideological architecture that kneels on the necks of Black people on a daily basis and demonizes Asians, Pacific Islanders, and all people of color. The recent rise in anti-Asian violence and the ongoing police attacks demonstrate the pervasive nature of racial animosity and structural racism. Today, our panelists of organizers, leaders, and scholars will discuss the successes and the challenges to building a racial justice movement that is inclusive and powerful. They will explore the cross-community tensions, but also the pathways to mutual solidarity and bridging. So with that, let me bring on our first guest. The first speaker is my longtime friend, Kat Brooks. Kat is the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project in Oakland and executive director of Justice Teams, the California statewide networks of grassroots organizations. Kat has spent her lifetime organizing to bring an end to unjust systems built into the societal status quo. Welcome, my sister. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Gerald.
I appreciate you coming on. I know you have an emergency and you can only stay for a short time, so let's just get right to it. Kat, just wanted to start out by asking you what's your relationship and the relationship of the two organizations that you're a part of to these two movements, the Anti-Asian Violence movement and the Black Lives Matter movement for police accountability.
So I'll start with Black Lives Matter movement for police accountability. I have been working as an organizer, Gerald, as you know, because I've known you just that long, my entire adult life. And really working to dismantle white supremacy and racist institutions and their impacts, right, on the quality of life for Black people specifically, but all folks. I cut my teeth on Black-Brown organizing at Community Coalition in South Central, which is where I learned some of my first lessons about the difficulty of organizing, right, across race, as well as the tools that we need to have the hard conversations, right? And it's where I learned also to identify that the enemy is not each other, the enemy is white supremacy. In 2009, Oscar Grant was murdered by former BART police officer Johannes Messerly, and that's when my organizing life took a sole focus on organizing against state terror. I'm a founding member of the Bay Area chapter of Black Lives Matter, which no longer exists. However, I continue to organize with the Anti-Police Terror Project to eradicate state violence. That said, my first real encounter with Asian organizers was when I moved to Oakland, right? And specifically when we launched Black Lives Matter and during 2014 and 2015, and when the Asian community came out and they formed the Asians for Black Lives, and they stood in solidarity with us. And they went and did what we asked people to do. They went and organized their own community and had conversations about anti-Blackness in their community and facilitated a space for us to have the conversation about the tensions, right, in our communities. What was real, what was fake, what role did white supremacy play, and what could we do to have these conversations with our people? Because we understand, I understand, my organization understands that collective struggle, as the Panthers taught us, means collective liberation.
Yes. Let me just ask you another question. I know you got to go, but talk about the historical and structural roots of both anti-Asian violence and anti-Black racism in both in the historical intersections of those, but also particularly around these narratives of the model minority for Asians and the criminalization of African Americans as a way to divide us. So what is your analysis of that historical intersections?
Well, actually, I want to start with the story, Gerald. I mean, I was, I say often, and I steal it from my mentor, Ayodele Nzinga, who says that before she took her first breath, God whispered into her ear, make art. I say God whispered into my right ear, make my left ear, make revolution. And so I ended up being born into a family of activists. My mother was an organizer. And so my analysis of white supremacy and its impact on us came at a young age. But my understanding at a young age of what was happening, and the need for unity across oppressed groups was clear at a very young age to me. And when I was 13, I was in the car with my father, and I said to him, I said, you know, Daddy, I said, if all the non-white folks could figure out that we're stronger together, they would be in trouble, huh, Daddy? And he just looked at me, where did that come from? And I, to this day, I don't know where it came from. I was happening at the time. But I remember that conversation so clearly. And so I've always understood that, right? And when you look at who built this country for white folks and white supremacist institutions to benefit, right? It's Black folks, it's Asian folks, it's Latinx folks. And what white supremacy has successfully done, unfortunately, is make us think that the only way that we can get what they have, the only way that we can achieve the American dream, right, is if we take it from each other, as opposed to focusing squarely on the person that's holding all of the resources, that's blocking all the doors to access to the institutions, the systems, the ideology, right, that is doing that. And so ideas and stereotypes about, I do media, right? I'm in the media, I'm a comms person, I'm a performer, and I'm an artist. If you just look at the propaganda that we are fed about each other, if you look at what Black communities are told about Asian communities, and if you look what Asian communities are told about Black communities, right? The way that hatred and the stereotypes and the tension is intentionally generated, that's one of the clearest ways that you can see that they keep us divided. And that's why, what I said earlier, what 13-year-old Kat knew was that as long as we're divided, then we cannot collectively struggle, therefore never getting to collective liberation.
And so how do we make sure that we can resist that? You know, we got Trump out of office, but Trumpism is alive and well. And it's creating these divisions and creating these false narratives. How can our social movements meet the challenge of the rising tide of white supremacy and authoritarianism?
We got Trump out of office, but we didn't get white supremacy out of America, right? Like, I think that there's been an issue with us conflating Trump's presidency with America being racist. America was born, right, out of racism. America's brand of capitalism is race-based capitalism. The status quo of America is for BIPOC labor to benefit white folks and white institutions and white supremacy. And so that's the first thing, right, for us to understand. There are a group of Black and Asian leaders that have been talking since this recent spate of anti-Asian violence, really trying to dig into what the answers are. And I don't know that any of us know that there is a silver bullet. What we do know is that we have to continue to have conversations amongst ourselves. But more importantly, it's the folks that are living the day-to-day lived reality, the lumpen, if you will, right? And I don't use that term often, but that's the term for me that's fascinating. The folks that are most impacted by the narratives, the folks that are most impacted by economic violence, by housing violence, by environmental violence, the folks that are most easily pitted against each other because they're fighting for a scrap on a plate. Those are where we need to have the conversations, and we need to lead by example, and we need to stand in solidarity, right? And when our Asian relatives are harmed, like we saw here in Oakland, Black organizations and organizers need to go stand at the ready to take care of our folks, to build protection programs, to continue to have the hard conversations about why more police, more surveillance are not the answer, because that harms both of our communities, and to stand in the gap, no matter what comment. And that can be hard, right? Because there are folks on both sides, right? But I'll just talk about the Black community that look at me and say, Kat, we have our own problems, right? Why are we wanting to go do X, Y, and Z for everybody else? But again, it's helping people connect the dots. I mean, it says the saying is best, right? If one of us isn't free, none of us are free.
There you go. Standing in the gap, connecting the dots. I appreciate you, Kat. I know you got to go. I know you got an emergency you got to attend to. Let's touch base later on. Thank you so much.
Mad love, Gerald. You know, I love you so much. Thank you for having this conversation.
All right. Now I want to bring up Ali Teray and Tracy La to continue this conversation. Tracy La is the executive director of Viet Rise, an organization that advances social and economic justice in Orange County, California, by organizing working class Vietnamese and immigrant communities. Tracy has been a community organizer for over 8 years, working on immigrant justice, voter registration, civic engagement, and youth empowerment. And joining us also is Ali Teray. She is a queer community organizer at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Ali is passionate about building collective power and leveraging that power to see systems dismantle. Ali was radicalized after taking an African American studies class and began organizing as a junior in college. Ali is zealous about centering queer and trans BIPOC folk in the struggle for liberation and wants to create a world where Black trans women domestically and internationally can have agency to make sustainable decisions about their bodies, their sexuality, and their lives. Welcome, Ali and Tracy.
Thank you, Gerald.
I want to start off by asking you the same question that I asked at the outset to Kat. So talk about your relationship to these two movements, the anti-Asian violence movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Tracy, you want to go?
Definitely. Thanks, Gerald, and thank you for having me. So as Gerald mentioned, I work in an organization and co-founded it called VitRise in 2018. And Orange County is the organization where it is based out of, or is the county where it's based out of. And Orange County is home to the largest community of Vietnamese people outside of Vietnam. We're actually one of the first social justice organizations ever developed in Orange County, dedicated to advancing a more progressive movement built on economic social justice. So I see that as part of the larger struggle, right, against anti-Asian violence and building Asian solidarity with other communities. So I think in the last couple of years, I'm going to start just with the recent movement against anti-Asian violence. And it was at the height of the pandemic, right when it first started last year in March. Locally here in Orange County, we kept hearing stories about local youth in high schools that are being bullied. Their families are receiving racist attacks, who are Asian, who are Vietnamese, from their peers, people at the workplace, blaming them for the reason why COVID was spreading. It didn't matter to them whether they were Chinese or not, which they were blaming it on. It just, if you looked Asian, if you looked Chinese, then it was you. And one of the first things we did was, it was people of color. Many people of color were doing these racist attacks against the Asian youth, Asian families, and so we didn't want it to change into a conversation of POC against Asians, white people against Asians, and we were alone. And so we tried doing a bunch of narrative press conference and actions to show that, what's needed right now is solidarity. What's needed right now is our communities of color coming together in support of us. But at the time, no one else said anything for a long time. And we knew that these acts of violence were continuing, but not many people were saying it. And I think it really picked up again, actually, earlier this year, when violence against elders started continuing and it started getting action in the media, right? And when, for us at VitRise, we work a lot on ending the deportation of Asian refugees, specifically Vietnamese refugees. And after Biden got elected, we heard another story about how Vietnamese people were going to be deported on a plane right after he got elected. And so we wanted to link that two together. Deportations, incarceration of refugees who fled war, who fled the devastation of their homelands, now being deported, a couple of decades later. We wanted to show that is anti-Asian violence too. And so we did, a rally right here in Westminster, in Little Saigon, in a place where that's not known. These actions are not known. We linked it together. We wanted to show structurally, this is what anti-Asian violence looks like. This is how the state perpetuates anti-Asian violence. And we wanted people around us to see that also. And unfortunately, where I live in Orange County, a lot of the narratives that are coming out is about, if we want to end racism, then let's just take interpersonal acts to change that. And so we had community leaders, Asian community leaders, partnering with the police. They partnered with the DA. They partnered with law enforcement to say stop Asian hate, and we need to track hate crimes. And we were one of the few organizations to say we need to stop doing that. We need to stop partnering with the police. We want to end anti-Asian violence. We need to stop advocating for policies that will actually further criminalize Black communities and Latinx communities. And that's where we're at right now. We want our community to understand that these are structural issues. If you want to end racism, if you want to end the violence against the communities, you have to take structural solutions, and you have to take solutions that are not going to criminalize and harm other communities. So that's where we're at with the anti-Asian violence movement. And I'll close also by saying, in 2014 was the turning point for me as an individual and how I saw my identity as a Vietnamese person, a child of refugees. It was when I saw, the police killing of Trayvon Martin, the police killing of Michael Brown, that completely changed my perspective on what this world looked like. At the time, I really thought like, all these people are going to be prosecuted. There's going to be accountability for the murder of 2 young Black men, and it didn't come. And that's when I really thought, like, what am I doing? What is this world I'm living in looks like? Maybe I was fed completely like untruth stories or false stories about what this country actually looked like. And so the Black Lives Matter movement opened up a whole new world for me about what is needed, or my role is, and how this world needs to change.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for the work that you do in Orange County, and look forward to working with you. Ali.
What's up? It's me.
What's up? How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I want to ask you the same question about your relationship to these 2 movements, the Anti-Asian Violence movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, in your role in the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta.
Yeah, for sure. I want to start off by saying that my pronouns are either Ali or Teray, just so folks know. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the campaign that I'm a part of, because I feel like that directly contributes, to each of the movements that you just named. So the campaign that I'm a part of is called Communities Over Capitalism. It has 2 long-range goals. That first long-range goal is to create the circumstances to add QT BIPOC, which is queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that are in North Atlanta that are also youth, anywhere between the ages of 18 and 35, into the abolitionist movement, or pushing them further into the abolitionist movement. And our second long-range goal is to create the circumstances to get our base, which is QT BIPOC North Atlanta youth, to practice abolition in real time through local autonomous organizing. So an example of that looks like we're currently working with a new mother in a community in a city called Clarkston. It's like predominantly immigrant and migrant folks. And our base chose to do some issue organizing around childcare. So we canvassed an apartment complex with a survey, asking them if they needed any childcare items purchased. We purchased baby clothes, we purchased food, we purchased diapers. And after that, on that survey, we also had a question around if anyone was interested in organizing. And that's how I met Farida, who is interested in creating a childcare network in her apartment complex to offset the cost of childcare. Excuse me. And with this campaign, we wanted to explicitly center Black single mothers, since they typically have the hardest time of paying for childcare. And I'm just really excited to see that coming into fruition through just real grassroots work. And yeah, I think that it's directly, related to those movements, just because the campaign really focuses on creating alternatives and creating solutions to structurally imposed violence and like state violence. And yeah, so that is essentially how I see myself as part of these movements, by creating solutions, creating alternatives, developing the leadership of the youth who are a part of the campaign to make this movement more sustainable. And yeah, that's all I want to say.
And Atlanta was one of the focal points of this anti-Asian violence. We saw a lot of coverage in the mainstream media. What is going on with that, and how is Asian American Advancing Justice responding to that, and how is African Americans in your community responding?
Yeah, I think that it looks like, so it's actually been kind of a lot. So our executive director has gotten in contact with the family, so that we've been trying to get some mutual aid items also to them to make them feel like they're taken care of, like they're being supported. So that I'm not personally a part of that work. I really only deal with the Communities Over Capitalism campaign. So I can't really speak too much on it, but I know that we've been purchasing mutual aid items. Some folks had been going to the massage parlor, I think. Yeah, the massage parlor that it was at, to also help folks out. Yeah. So that, I think that the other Black folks who have been a part of Asian Americans Advancing Justice have just been reaching out to our Asian comrades, asking them if they need support, what that support looks like. And yeah, really just talking to them and asking them what they need and letting them name for themselves what it is that they need.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that you and your organization are doing.
Thank you.
Now I want to bring into the conversation Dr. Melina Abdullah. Melina, are you here? I see your name, but I don't see you. Welcome, Melina. Dr. Melina Abdullah is professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and co-director of Black Lives Matter Grassroots, and a mama for 3 children. Welcome. I can see you now.
Thank you for having me. It's great to meet you. And thank you to the comrades in struggle. And you know that Kat Brooks is one of my dearest friends and closest comrades. So I know she's not on, but I really don't need to say anything. I can just say, underline, replay all the shit all the stuff Kat just said.
Right on.
I cuss a lot.
Yeah. I just want to hear from you about what Black Lives Matter Grassroots is doing in relationship to these 2 movements against police violence and against anti-Asian violence. What is your relationship and the relationship of your organizations to these movements?
So Black Lives Matter continues to be on the front line to try to not just, there's a lot of context around the murder of George Floyd. People keep talking about police reform. We are not a reformist organization. We believe that the system of policing is irredeemable, and that we have to fundamentally reimagine, but also transform and build new systems of public safety. And so that's the approach of Black Lives Matter. That's been our stance since the beginning. It's one of the reasons why we call for defunding of the police, not just, reform of the police. That's our approach. As we talk about anti-Asian violence, it's really important that we not allow ourselves to be pitted against one another, as I think has been the deliberate attempt by mainstream media and also power centers of power throughout this country. We know that when we talk about what happened, what some of the incidents that have occurred in the Bay Area, we know that Black folks and Asian folks share the same space. And, I was raised, I think I shared this with you, that I was raised in East Oakland, and the area of East Oakland I was raised in was almost fully populated by nothing but Black and Asian folks, right? I went to an elementary school that was about 50-50 Black and Chinese. And so when you talk about what happens, when you talk about intra-communal violence, that's intra-communal, which means that it's all of us occupy the same space, and it's not necessarily, and I don't want to minimize the targeted assaults on Asian folks, but we have to understand geographic context and community context when you talk about some folks, especially in Bay Area communities. Of course, we did see targeted attacks happen in Atlanta at the hands of white supremacists, at the hands of folks outside of our communities. And then, of course, when you talk about folks who are unwell, folks who are unwell are simply unwell. I think that what it has opened up is an opportunity for us to more deeply explore the long history of Black Asian solidarity, which is both long and complicated, right? We can go all the way back to the 19th century and talk about some of the words of Frederick Douglass and his commitment to Asian liberation as he was struggling for Black freedom. We can talk about, you talked about May 19th and the sharing of birthdays, but also sharing of political positioning between Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama, right? We can think about the way in which people like Grace Lee Boggs were deeply invested in Black liberation, and things like the Third World Movement, the Third World Student Strike, which gave birth to ethnic studies, and a long history of the liberation of all Third World people. And so I think it's really important that we understand that long and complicated history. I think it's important that we think about contemporary history, where we've seen a form of organic solidarity, where Asian folks have engaged in the struggle for Black Lives Matter. I think that the powers that be feel threatened by that kind of solidarity, and why they're trying to manipulate I guess, discord, trying to sow seeds of discord between our folks. And I think that it's important that we have courageous conversations around that. I'm grateful for the way that it's helped the Black Lives Matter movement moment has helped to bring together so many of us in, again, organic solidarity, right? And so in Los Angeles, we have Third World Power, which has been built by Asian folks, Pacific Island folks, indigenous folks, and Latinx, Chicanx folks, all recognizing that it's in their best interest to struggle for Black freedom. I think up in the Bay Area, when we had a Black Lives Matter chapter there, we also had an Asians for Black Lives chapter that was pivotal, especially in the early moments of Black Lives Matter. And so I think there's an opportunity, again, for us to continue to build. I'm really grateful to the Asian folks who are not falling for the okie doke. When LAPD says, you know, there's assault on Asian folks, you need more police in your neighborhoods, or in the neighborhoods where your stores are that are largely populated by Black communities. There's so many in the Asian communities who say, you know, police don't keep us safer. We have to do a better job in building solidarity with our neighbors. And at the same time, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. We know that there's also ongoing tensions, and that's the work that we have to do. You know, we're still not healed from the murder of Latasha Harlings. We're still not healed from many practices, which I think really illuminate different class positionings as well as differences in racial positionings.
Yes. Thank you for that historical perspective. I appreciate that. I want to bring all of our guests together to field these next questions. So if we can get everybody on screen. And Melina, you spoke to the historical solidarity that had been shown between Asian Pacific Islander and Black folks. I want to talk about the history of white supremacy and how it has divided us, particularly looking at these myths of the model minority when referring to Asians, and on the other side, the criminalization of African Americans that supports this divide and conquer strategy. So we know that this is rooted in the historical and structural roots of the U.S. So how do we address those divide and conquer tactics, those false narratives that are sometimes very alive and well in our communities? Any one of you can go.
Well, I think Kat already kind of gave us this, right? That we can't fall for it. We know that they're divide and conquer strategies. We know what they're trying to do. We have to keep our eyes on white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism and say that that is the target that we must topple. And, you know, of course, we have to talk through challenges that we face between our communities, but really the war, the long and beautiful struggle that we're engaged in is about toppling the larger system of white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism. And we do that by doing work that's true to our communities alongside one another.
Yes. I'm going to ask if there's any questions for the audience. You can put it in the chat and we'll try to answer some of those questions. Tracy, you want to tackle this question? You're on mute, Tracy.
Sorry, you think I'll get used to that, but I want to add to what Melina had said. And then what I want to advocate and what I'm always going to advocate for is we need specific structural solutions to all of this. And we need to understand the history of where the model minority came from in the first place and why it was created. So I think many of us on this call right now remembers the Chinese Exclusion Act, when the US tried to keep Chinese people from coming here, when before that they had been asked to come here so that they could work on the railroads and other, infrastructure projects for the United States to build this country. In 1906, for example, right here in Santa Ana, we used to have a Chinatown. It was burnt down because people said that, because white residents here in the city said that we had disease, right? And then for Vietnamese people, who just came here in the 70s and 80s, just right here in Orange County, many people look at Orange County now and think of it as a place where Vietnamese people are very conservative. Our people did vote for Trump in our community. But when we first got here, there were countless people telling us to go back. We had the president of the United States saying that, we had mayors saying that, we had city council members saying that just here in the 70s that Vietnamese people don't belong here and they need to go back, right? And I think to address and to end the division that's been created by the model minority, we have to understand what it was like before that. And so sometimes I feel like Asian people are used as a convenient tool against other communities. And the relationship from the state to us changes when it's convenient for them, to propose other things, like expand policing, like, target Black and brown communities. So that education is important. We have to know where we come from and why, what it's used for. What do other people have to lose from Asians being seen as a model minority, right? And we need to create structural safeguards in our laws, in our policies to change that.
Thank you, Tracy. Let's hear from Ali. Ali, what do you think about this question?
So this is okay. So for me, when I think about the historical and structural roots around anti-Blackness, for the first part of this question, slavery comes to mind. And I'm thinking about the legacy of slavery, as it relates to Black people's lived experiences. This question also makes me think of how Black folks and Asian folks experience two different structures of violence, and how one is based on social death and slavery, which is a relational dynamic also, I want to add, and destroying subjectivity, and how the other is based on exploitation and alienating subjectivity without destroying said subjectivity, right? So yeah, I think that speaks to the historical and structural roots around anti-Blackness. And for the second part of the question, how has the model minority myth about Asians and the criminalization of African Americans supported a divide and conquer strategy? I think that the model minority myth contributes to this whole idea around pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do it yourself. You can do it racism doesn't exist. And so, yeah, that's what I think of also when I hear the model minority myth and how it contributes to the criminalization of African Americans.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think this whole notion that pulling yourself from the bootstraps is foundational to the founding of this country and really denies that racism exists. So I appreciate that comment. I want to turn to another question that I asked Kat and want to get your take on. We did defeat Trump at the polls, and Trump is gone, but Trumpism is very much alive and well. White supremacy has grown tremendously over the last 5 or 6 years. And so I want to ask you all, how can our social movements meet this challenge? What, both the ideological and narrative challenge, but also the challenge of organizing on the ground? Tracy, you want to start?
Go ahead, Ali. I think you.
Go ahead, Ali.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, I think to answer this question, investing in alternatives, also building power with your neighbors, creating solutions to the urgency of violence if you feel like it exists. And yeah, I think that the only way that you'll be able to find that out is if you talk to your neighbors, if you talk to your community. So that I also think taking more seriously, the fact that people who call themselves Trumpers, are have a vested interest in defending white supremacy. I think that a lot of people take Trumpers as quote unquote like stupid and like they don't take them seriously when they have like a vested interest in defending and upholding white supremacy. So I think also taking that more seriously, yeah, and not just treating them, like they're obtuse. So yeah, I would say that.
Thank you. Tracy, you want to go?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna add by saying kind of like a hard thing is that I think honestly as a movement, I think we've failed epically about responding to the white supremacist insurrection that happened at the Capitol. Because I'm gonna say why, and I'm gonna do it by comparing two things. Last year, we had comrades in North Carolina, Southeast Asians, Black communities, who came together to do an action against Tony Pham. Tony Pham is the former director of ICE. He was a Vietnamese refugee. He used his identity as a Vietnamese refugee to put up racist billboards targeting other immigrants in the community. And so we knew what he was doing. He was using our identity to target other Black and brown immigrant communities, to justify his role as the director of ICE. And so what happened was Siak Village, Charlotte Uprising, Southeast Asian and Black organizers went to his house and held him accountable. They called him out for all the people who died in ICE, and it wasn't just one community. But what happened was all those organizers, they had charges put against them. One person got arrested in front of their children. And so this is what happens when we call out the state. When people of color, when Black people, when Asian people, when anyone from a community of color calls out the state, we get reprimanded, we get charges, we get convictions. And then what happens when white supremacists take on the state? Nothing happens to them. They're not held accountable at all.
Yeah.
There's been no one arrested, none of that happening. And I think we need to talk about how we're going to hold white supremacists accountable. They're not going to care about doing restorative justice with us. They're not going to care about doing transformative justice. They need to be held structurally accountable. And we need to identify all the people who are part of the police, who are part of the military, who are now in elected office, who were there at that rally. They've infiltrated every part of this country's structures, this government. And we need to do more to call them out. We need to find the individuals. We need to find the groups. I think that's how our social movements can meet that. We need to call for that because, our communities deserve justice. And we need to compare, this is what happens when we take on the state, and this is what happens when white supremacists do. They get away with it.
Yeah.
I think that's how our movements need to meet it.
Thank you for that. There's a big difference between how those insurrectionists were treated and how Black Lives Matter movement activists have been treated across the country, with police coming down so hard and beating people and putting people in jail. So I think that we need to address that in a way that lifts up the contradictions. Lena, what's your take on how we meet this challenge of rising white supremacy?
Right. I think we take note of it and we remember the ways in which all forms of white supremacy are connected. So I hear what Tracy's saying about we need them to basically be found out and face repercussions through the system. However, if we're honest, the system enabled it and empowered it and was a part of it, right? So I don't actually think that systemic responses are the responses that bring us to safety. I think we should be very clear. As Tracy was pointing out, many of the white supremacist terrorists were in fact members of law enforcement. And we have to remember that members of law enforcement helped people engage, helped those white supremacist terrorists get through the Capitol that day, right? That they helped them up and down stairs, that they moved barriers for them, that they took pictures with them because that's whose side they're on. And so it's really important that we remember that, because that kind of white supremacist terrorism that made a show at the Capitol actually makes threats on the lives of those of us who dare to work towards the dismantling of white supremacy, right? So we saw what happened on whatever day that was in January. Was it the 7th? Something like that, right? Whatever day that was in January. But we also should take note of the fact that every single day, those same kinds of white supremacist terrorists make threats on the lives of Black organizers. That same kind of white supremacist terrorism, and this is not meant to say, you know, oh, woe is me, but it was a white supremacist terrorism who called into LAPD in August of last year and had my home swatted with myself and my 3 children in it. And then LAPD was complicit with them. They said that they were coming for Black Lives Matter, and they still came, surrounded my home with AR-15 rifles, put a helicopter overhead, and terrorized and traumatized myself and my 3 children. We have to remember it's the same kind of white supremacist terrorism that put on a list of possible assassination targets Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza. And they had to be, that plot had to be foiled. And so I think that when we look at white supremacist terrorism, and I refuse to call them insurrectionists because our ancestors were insurrectionists, right? Insurrection has an underlying connotation of struggling against an unjust system. They are not struggling against an unjust system. They're struggling in concert with an unjust system, right? And so these white supremacist terrorists are coming for us. And so we have to think about how we keep us safe. What community solutions to our public safety do we have? How do we refuse to listen to right-wing rhetoric like we see in the New York Post that tries to come for our organizers and say they don't have a right to live or love the way that they want to love or build the way that they want to build, right? How are we allowing our movements to be derailed by white supremacist terrorism? And what will we do to bring structures of safety for ourselves?
Thank you for that. So what do those structures of safety look like, and how do we address the fact that we still have to deal with these police departments at the local level? And what is the role of changing policy at the national and local level is? I want to answer that question, and we'll get to questions from our audience.
So I can be really quick. Like at the national level, we need to look at transformative policies like the Breathe Act. People who want to find out more can go to breatheact.org. Locally, I don't care if Barack Obama wants to call it a snappy slogan. I'll say, yeah, it is pretty snappy. But when we say defund the police, that's a policy demand. We're saying take our dollars out of policing, invest in the things that actually make communities safe, like housing, healthcare, mental health resources, education, good jobs for our people. And all of us can be engaged in that. I know that budget work isn't sexy work, but it's important work. And then we need to think about just how do we pass policies that are survival pending revolution? So in California, we're trying to pass the Kenneth Ross Jr. police decertification bill, which will snatch the guns and badges of police officers who kill and abuse our community members without waiting for a DA to prosecute them. That almost never happens. And so we can at the very least, snatch their guns and badges. The officer who murdered Kenneth Ross Jr. on April 11th, 2018, this was his 4th shooting. He actually comes from Orange County, Tracy, and had shot 3 people already under an Orange County policing unit, and then was able to quit before he was fired, get another job in Gardena where he killed Kenneth Ross Jr. So we have to do that. And then finally, we have to remember that policy is only one answer. It's only survival pending revolution. It's only non-reformist reform in its best format, right? That the real work of transformation takes boots on the ground. It takes protest as well as policy. And so we should all be engaged in the ongoing work of protest. Right now, Black Lives Matter is recognizing who our enemy is, recognizing that one of the most significant places that white supremacy is housed is in police associations that pretend to be unions but are not, because they're in opposition, not solidarity with other working class people. So one of our global campaigns is to end police associations, get them ousted from the House of Labor, make sure they don't have the power to bully and bribe elected officials anymore, and get them out of the pilfering of the public purse, where they're continuing to demand more than 50% of most cities' general funds for police, which means that they're starving the resources for our community members.
Thank you for that. Let's go to our audience and see what questions that are popping up from the folks that are listening and watching us. Do we have questions?
Can I add a little bit to?
Yeah, yes, you
think a little
can.
bit
Go,
to your last question.
go for it.
There's this quote that by Fred Hampton where he says, and this is about like how our social movements are going to respond to the rise of white supremacy. You know, it's animation, or the animated white supremacy that's grown in the last few years, ever more than ever before. So he always said, you know, we're not going to fight fire with fire. We're not going to fight racism with more racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. And I think, you know, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build coalitions. We're having this conversation because we're trying to show people that this solidarity, this shared struggle between our communities is possible. And it's not going to be possible, you know, even through one panel or some discussions. It's going to be possible at building the individual relationships between organizers that you can trust. And I think, you know, I want to uplift again what Melina just said about defund the police is a policy demand. And we need to hear Asian people say the police don't keep us safe. And it never has. And I can give you countless examples of the ways that our community has been targeted by the police, you know, but we're only a little bit of it, right? We need to understand the ways that what we think is going to keep us safe actually hurts other communities instead, it hurts Black people, Black communities instead. And I think that's something really important that we have to get through. I think I'm going to end there, but I think there's countless ways that our movements need to meet it that we're not right now. I think there's countless conversations that we need to have. But I believe it's possible. And I think I also want to say that what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement in the last year or so has completely changed the way that I think social and structural change is possible in this country. We're making statements about Palestine that before a year ago, that could never have, you know, we wouldn't see a mass support for it the way that we do now, where corporations being held accountable for talking about Palestine and human rights violations in Palestine. Same thing, you know, it's like, it's a corporate activism, but now they're all saying Black Lives Matter. But it's not just, you know, words at this point. We're actually seeing structural change happen. We're seeing police unions start to lose their power locally because community members are calling for it, and because this is what that movement did. So I want to highlight really good examples of where I've seen it be possible, because I think these are examples that we need to learn from and that we need to replicate and tailor to fit our local communities everywhere we can.
Thank you for that. I want to return to that theme of shared struggle in a minute, Tracy, but I want to see if we have some questions from the audience that we can delve into. You want to throw up a question from the audience? So this is from Judy. Can BLM and all communities of color support APIs who are now calling for more police and more enforcement accountability against the violence targeting Asians? So what do you all think? Some Asian Americans are calling for more policing at the same time that Black Lives Matter is saying defund the police. How is that working out in your communities? What are the dynamics and the discussions going on about this?
Right. I hear where the question from Judy's coming from, but I really have to disagree, right? At least the question where you say, how can Black Lives Matter support APIs? Are calling for that. Because on one end, I do think there needs to be accountability, you know, for all the violence that's being targeted toward Asian elders, Asian people. I think, you know, we can't just let that go. We have to find a way so that our community feels safe. You know, people don't get away with harming others. And there's some kind of transformative justice culture, and also, you know, very specific action steps that can be done so that our community gets a sense of justice and feel a sense of safety. But if other communities who have been, and Black communities especially, who've been violently targeted by the police since the founding of the country, are saying that police as a solution is not going to work, then we have to find other solutions, right? If we want to build solidarity, if we want to be real about what's needed so that everyone can feel safe, not just us as Asians, then we have to find different solutions. And that those solutions are already happening. Like, I know that For example, I think the Anti-Police Terror Project just started putting up an alternative line for policing, right? I saw the billboard we put up recently. There's tons of community solutions that can approach and bring the accountability and the support that we want. And it's not going to be the police, right? Those solutions are there.
Ali, what do you think about this question? This
Could you put up the first question?
Can you put that question back up?
Yeah. Can BLM and all communities of color support APIs are now calling for more police and more enforcement / accountability against the violence targeting Asians? I think for the first question, I personally can't support anyone that supports the police because they contribute to the death and murder of Black people. So that's just period for the first question. Second question, how do BLM calls for defunding police counterbalance AAPI calls for more effective policing? Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to this either. So yeah, I'm not gonna speak on this one because sorry.
That's okay. I'm gonna bring Melina in on these questions. Melina, what are you thinking?
I'll just double down on anybody who's supporting policing, is not really someone that I can build with. I'm willing to engage around why we want to defund the police on our road to abolition, right? I'm willing to engage around why ending policing, abolishing the police doesn't mean abolishing public safety. In fact, it means investing in more effective public safety. So I'm willing to engage in that way. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, so talk about the investments that you think would increase public safety without policing.
Well, we already know. We already know what pretty much every sociologist, historian, economist, political scientist will tell you, that when you meet the needs of people, crime plummets, right? We already know that a recent study showed that police are only effective in solving less than 2% of violent crime. So anybody who thinks they're safer because there's police, just think about that number, right? If you were only effective at teaching 2% of your students, or we were only effective in serving 2% of our customers at a restaurant, we not only lose our jobs, but our entire industry would go to, be gone, right? And so police are not the answers to public safety. If you want to get to the answers to public safety, you're talking about building community and flooding those communities with resources. So the effective approach is actually to end policing as we know it, to support communities, to make sure that we resource programs like, I remember when I first moved to Los Angeles and I was living in Leimert Park, and I would watch every morning, all of the old folks would come and sit on their porches. And I finally asked my neighbor who lived in my building, Miss Gordon, who was one of the folks who was sitting on her porch, I would be like, why do y'all come out and sit on the porch first thing in the morning? They have their coffee cups and they'd be talking back and forth to each other. And she said, oh, we're watching the babies walk to school. And so every morning, the community, that older folks would come and sit on their porch and make sure our children got to the middle school right down the street safely. That's an answer to public safety, right? It's also building a strong community. And so we need to resource programs like that. And the spending on police prevents us from doing that. And it also prevents us from being not just imaginative, but logical about what brings safety. If you have a city like mine in Los Angeles, they've now counted 60,000 unhoused folks. How are you going to have a safe community with 60,000 unhoused folks, mostly Black folks, living in tents? That's not going to be a safe city, right? Let's provide our people with all of what they need, housing and healthcare and mental health resources, and all of the things that they need, good food. Let's provide them with all the things that they need, and then we'll see how safe our communities become.
Thank you, Melina. You brought up for me my own memories of growing up in South Central LA, 49th and Broadway. Mama Chichi and Daddy Longlegs were the elderly couple that sat on their porch and watched us go to school. And if they saw us doing anything wrong, they would also knock on our front door and report it to our parents. So that was a level of safety that we felt as kids growing up. So that kind of investment in communities, I think you're absolutely right. And we saw this in the 1970s, once Black folks in LA and in Oakland and in cities across this country were able to break into these good union jobs in the tire and rubber industry, in the auto industry, in the steel industry. The economics in Black communities shot up, and crime went dramatically down. And as soon as those factories picked up and left our communities, and these corporations moved them to Asia and Latin America, and our economics started to decline, and crack cocaine was introduced into our communities, it began to destroy our communities. And so I think these investments that you're talking about are really critical to public safety. And part of our challenge is to redefine what is public safety and to create the opportunities to invest in our communities. So thank you for those remarks. Any other?
Could I
yes.
also add? Yeah, cool. So also just wanted to add, like, since we're talking about policing, I want to also add, like, the military counts as a form of police, right? So not only like abolish, defund the police locally, but also abolish all the motherfuckers, like abolish the military. So yeah, I just wanted to name that as well. And I want to name, like, imperialism being a thing. The fact that, like Melina mentioned earlier, like the budget is like 50% for the military. And like health and human services is like a super small number. So yeah, I just wanted to name that, like, when we talk about this, we mean like abolish police globally, like abolish all of them. And I think when we talk about like Black liberation movements, right, if it's not something that's global, and if your solidarity isn't something that's global, like there's Black people that exist outside of the US. So how are we making sure that we're standing in solidarity with the Black people that aren't here, in our like vision, on our first glance, right? And yeah, I know that y'all were talking about policy also earlier, and it reminds me of why I don't do policy and why I don't interact with the state, because I know that in any capacity, that means that Black folks are gonna die. No matter what capacity I interact with the state, any legislation, it's gonna contribute to a Black person dying by interacting with the government. So yeah, I just wanted to name that.
So thank you for bringing in that international perspective. We know that white supremacy is a global phenomenon, and the structures of white supremacy are global. And so I think you're right. We need to interact with our counterparts across the world, across what we used to call back in the day the third world, and really understand how white supremacy manifests itself in other countries, and what the U.S. role is in perpetuating white supremacy across the globe. So thank you for that perspective. Do we have other questions from our audience? From Paige Passano. For any of the panelists, please share any of your creative approaches to draw community members into this work who tend to hang back, who do not see themselves as activist types. Anybody want to take on this question?
Yes, definitely. I can start. So earlier I mentioned that Fair Rise was one of the first organizations in Orange County here locally. And I'm always going to talk about the local perspective because that's the one I know best. That was created to build new leadership among young people, especially to address socioeconomic racial injustice in the county and to build something different so that we could live in a totally different community with structural solutions that actually benefit and assure the safety of all of our lives. And so from that, that was 2018, that was just a few years ago. There's tons of people in our community who did not either want to be engaged for whatever reason, don't feel safe. Many young people we work with, for example, their parents were refugees. They were in the war. And our community is new to the US in a lot of ways. We come from a country that was, where the murder and the war of our people was broadcasted, for all of the US to see. And the community that we have here in Orange County, especially, there's a culture in our communities where we hesitate to speak up for what we believe in, for fear of repercussion from our elders, for fear of repercussion in many other ways. And so what we've been working on is ending that sense of fear. And we end that sense of fear and encourage more people to join by being unapologetic about what we believe in. So it's very rare for people to see a Vietnamese person in Orange County say we need to defund the police, for example. So some of us are going to go out and say it. It's very rare for people in our community to say, unfortunately, locally, yes, it is very rare to say we need to build coalition with Black and Brown communities. So we're going to say it. And then we need to create the spaces so that people who do want to be part of it feel like they can build their leadership and feel like they can participate. And that's what's happening, right? And I think I love this question because it's very, very important for us as organizers to meet our community where we're at, right? If we're going to be about the masses, if we want to educate the masses, we want to organize the masses, then we have to meet our community where we're at. And sometimes they're not always there with us. Sometimes they really disagree with what we're saying. Sometimes they have a totally different worldview and experience that doesn't match the world we want to be part of, but we want them to be part of our world too. Especially your working class, especially if you're from, what people call third world countries, especially if you're directly impacted by policing, directly impacted by, street violence, incarceration. And that's where a lot of members of our community come from, the people we work with. So we're going to do the work, right? To make sure that they can be part of this too, or that the world we're building is part of the world that they might want to live in one day. So we try to demystify this idea of romanticization of what activism looks like, because it's about just changing our lives for the better, right? So everyone comes for a different reason. Some people want to be activists because they believe in a better world. Other people just want their daily lives to get better. So we recognize that, we make a space for everyone.
I can also speak to this question. I think ultimately it's important to build relationships with people. I think that honestly, like the foundation of organizing and how we're going to change the world is through relationships. And I think being intentional about how we build those relationships with people. And I think that Tracy, to what you were speaking to around being the organizers, like that's where we come in order, and we have learned and have the experience of developing people's leadership, moving people through the ladder of engagement, making this work more sustainable. And yeah, ultimately though, I think that bringing folks in who aren't quote unquote like activists, it just looks like building a relationship with them, talking to them, talking to your neighbors. An example could be like in your apartment complex, talking to your neighbors and putting your neighbors in a centralized group chat, so that we all are in a proactive position to potentially, and this is just for if you're in an apartment complex, but putting yourself in a proactive position to where if like property management does something or if management does something, then y'all are already organized in a centralized location to where y'all can communicate with each other easily and then act as opposed to react, right? So yeah, I think it's talking to your neighbors, building those relationships, hosting stuff at your apartment if you're down and you want to like get to know your neighbors in that way. But yeah, that's what I think ultimately would be the solution.
Melina, how are you bringing people into movement in LA? People who don't identify as being activists.
Well, I think that there's a misconception about what it means to be an activist, that people think that activism means only, getting in the streets or speaking on a mic. But organizing and activism is also about, I'll give one example. So one of my dear friends, his mom loves Black Lives Matter, and she lives in a retirement home. And she's like, oh, I support you. Just letting you know I support you, but I can't get out there in the streets. But everybody in her retirement community loves Black Lives Matter. Well, all of our meetings, all of our council meetings, all of our police oversight meetings are online now. And they're in the middle of the day strategically so that, you know, people who work regular jobs or are in school during traditional hours can't participate. But you know who can participate? All the retirees in that facility that can't get out in the streets. So, you know, you love us, you want to support us. Here's how you can love and support us. Can you call in to the police commission meeting and say this, right? Because they're trying to increase the police budget. So this is a way that some folks have become activists even when they thought they couldn't. My mother, who's now 72 years old, right, has a group of her friends that she talks to on the phone all the time. Well, you know, I believe in spirituality, and so do they. So I asked them, will they do intentional prayer work for us? And they do. Every single Wednesday, there is a Black Mamas prayer circle for Black Lives Matter. And that's activism, you know, and it's really helped. And it's whatever you have, whatever gifts you have, whatever resources you have, bring it to the movement. And that's how we have to frame activism. It's activist if you can. We got a group called Snack Block, right, that brings a wagon full of hot Cheetos and water to all of our protests. That makes all the kids want to come to the protests, right? Because they got their fill of hot Cheetos, right? And, you know, that's all activism. So no, you don't have to be on the mic unless you want to. Anybody who wants to watch, every Wednesday we protest in front of the LA Police Protective League. One of our members is a dancer. And we always start with libation. And then we start with, I know it doesn't sound like activism, but Karina gets up and she stretches us for like 10 minutes. And all of that is activism. And we just have to remember that we define what activism is.
Yes. Start where people are at and redefine activism. I appreciate that. I want to move to a question, and then we're going to try to wrap up. So as I mentioned at the start of this program, the sub-theme of it is Beyond Solidarity, Bridging the Black-Asian Divide. So we know that solidarity is a critical step. It's meaningful and it's powerful. But I want to go further and talk about bridging. And by that I mean, how can we go further towards a shared identity, a shared sense of destiny, and a shared vision of a future for our communities, one that's built on being as one with one another. So that's what I would say is a vision of bridging. Talk to me about what you think about that, and can we get to that?
I can start. So earlier I brought up, Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, and I bring them up because the Black Panthers and their support for the Vietnamese struggle, it wasn't like a US struggle, it was a Vietnamese international struggle. That, I think, was the pinnacle of when we were at our best when it came to shared struggle, shared identity even, right? Because they understood that our liberation as Vietnamese people in Vietnam was same, for all across the world. And so to that question of is it possible? Yes, it is possible, because there was a moment when that was happening. And I think there are many pockets in this country where that shared struggle, that shared identity is being built also in the ways that communities are obviously, one, responding to the police, like Alina mentioned, and then in the ways that we're responding to immigration and deportation in our work here in California. So I think that's what I envision. I want to recognize too that obviously talking about the police is a big point of tension between Asian and Black communities, right? Like just like looking at the way this conversation went, looking at the comments, we have to talk about it. And I think we have to be upfront about when we get angry at each other, frustrated and tired of hearing about, what we see as BS. But we have to have the conversations, and we have to acknowledge the points of tension when it comes up. I think the other thing I want to add is that, again, like the way we're going to build shared struggle, shared identity is by building individual relationships. So I'm really grateful for this conversation, listening to everyone talk, and I'm really appreciative of the comments because we're engaging with each other. But we also have to have trusted people who can be facilitators of building that coalition between each other, right? I see you as that, Gerald. So I think that's really awesome for one. But it's going to take a lot of work, right? So I believe I believe that world's possible. We saw it. We saw it with the Rainbow Coalition. We saw it the way that Black Panther supported the Vietnamese struggle in Vietnam. We see it here when we're fighting against deportation and ICE and immigration enforcement here in California. And so that work is going to continue and it's going to grow stronger. I know it.
Yes. Ali, what are you thinking about this question?
I think this is a really tricky question for me, actually. I want to offer pushback, actually, around like this idea around a quote unquote shared identity. I think that homogenizes like all of our experiences. And I think it's important to note, like, you know, the differences between like Black people and then POC. So how I mentioned earlier, you know, that Black folks experience a certain structure of violence that's radically different than like other POC and other races experience. So I want to name that. What else? I also want to name that I think that it's important that, like, you know, we all accept that, like, we all have we experience structures of violence differently, and that's okay, and it can be different, and that'd be fine. So I think that accepting that is the first step, and I also think that it looks like folks showing up for Black lives, and yeah, being on the front lines. So, yeah.
Yeah. Did we lose Melina? I don't see her on the screen. Well, let me just say that, you know, I came of age in the 1960s, and that was a time of changing identities in a major way. So I was born a Negro, and through the course of the 1960s, our identity changed to be Black. And, you know, when I grew up, if you call somebody Black, that was fighting words. But we struggled through that, and we became Black and then African American. So the identities began to change. At the same time, there was a parallel movement where we began to identify as people of color. That did not negate my Blackness or being African American. I think you can hold different identities at the same time. That people of color identity was an identity that said that the Chicano movement, the African American movement, the Asian identity movement, all these movements had a common political analysis, a common framework, and a common struggle against white supremacy and economic exploitation. And so I think this notion of bridging says that you can hold the identity that you came to the table with and also adopt another identity that is a broader identity that does not take away from your original identity. So that's the issue that I wanted to try to bring up in terms of this notion of bridging, that we can come together without negating our original identities. I think we need to close. We have a few more minutes. I want to just ask a final question to everyone, and I hope Melina can come back. I just want you to talk about what needs to happen to keep the momentum going in these social movements and what's on the horizon that can bring meaningful change, and what gives you hope as we move forward. And then finally, what is your call to action? What should we be doing to further the movement for racial justice and democracy?
I can start with what has gave me hope, actually. So for the last 6 months, actually for almost 5 years now, we've been fighting for the freedom of Karim Golding. He's a Black Jamaican Muslim immigrant who was detained by ICE for almost 5 years after being transferred from federal prison to ICE detention. He was in one of the worst detention centers in the country. And every step of the way, we took on, we tried to use the courts to get him free. We organized, we called ICE, we did all these things. Every step of the way, ICE tried to keep Karim in detention. But just last Friday, around 9 p.m. on Eastern time, we found out that he's now free. 5 years in ICE detention, all these things working against him, trying to keep him there. He fought. and now he's free. And we built a multiracial national coalition of organizations and individuals to make sure that Karim was free. And Karim has taught me so much also about the ways that he is someone who advocated for more PPE testing for other detainees when he was there. And he did that by organizing in multiracial solidarity with other detainees who were there also. He was like, we all need testing. We're all being subjugated to COVID, catching COVID. And he organized with other people. And in these detention centers, they're very racially segregated, as it is in prisons. But he was able to organize everyone, for safety for everyone. And so that gives me hope, because we never stopped. We fought for years, and it's possible. We did it together. We did it without the state, obviously, but we did it using all the tools that we had, right, as much as we can. And the last thing I want to highlight too, my call to action is, I really encourage everyone to learn also about past really surface level narratives of what you hear about Asian people, and look deeper into things that, for example, Southeast Asians are facing. We're facing deportation, we're facing criminalization. Many of us are refugees that are facing these circumstances. And right now we have a campaign for someone named An Nguyen. Came here when he was a refugee. He was incarcerated when he was a teenager, when he was young. And instead of being released after 20 years in prison, he is now subject to deportation. Anne's story tells a story of many Black immigrants, Latino immigrants, Southeast Asian immigrants, and what they have faced, and that I think many people in this country still don't know about. So I really want to encourage you. Right now, we're trying to fight for Anne's freedom from deportation. If you can go to that link that's up there on the screen. We need to stop ICE transfers. We want to keep our community members home where they're at with our community. And so we invite you to join in the fight with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Ali, what gives you hope? What's on your horizon, and what's your call to action?
I think what gives me hope, honestly, I just want to say Black people. Like, Black people give me hope. I love Black people. I love my niggas. So yeah, Black people give me hope. The other question, what is on the horizon? Communities Over Capitalism is on the horizon, y'all. So put that link up and click it. I feel like a YouTuber right now. Click the link below, you know what I'm saying, to join the campaign. It's based in Atlanta, but you don't have to be in Atlanta to join. We have like a lot of digital options for people to engage. So yeah, please slide to that link. We need your brilliance. We need the power. We need the people power. So yeah, that is how I will answer that question. So yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Melina, and thank you, Kat. This has been a very interesting conversation. We want to continue these Black Lives Matter, these Rise Up for Justice, Black Lives, and our collective future live stream events going forward. If you RSVP'd for this event, then you're on our mailing list, and you will get notices of other events coming up throughout the year. I appreciate all of you all who were panelists. I appreciate all of the audience. I want to give a shout out to Mark, who did the behind the scenes work to get us on screen and getting the questions, and did a great job. And until we meet again, I appreciate everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Fred Hampton, one of the chairmen of the Black Panthers, said, "We're gonna fight racism, not with racism. We're gonna fight it with solidarity."
This is why I say, let me explain. I'm from the Bay, so we dance a little different. Asian means proud, Asian means loud, Asian means proud, Asian means loud, Asian means proud, Asian means loud.
Asian American women have the highest suicide rates of any racial group. And on top of all of this, we must deal with being fetishized and targeted by those that think that we won't speak up or fight back. Today and from now on, I encourage you all to speak up and share how you feel. We must get engaged in our communities, raise our voices, and push for change.
solidarity is the biggest sword we have against racial injustice. It's not just an Asian issue, and it's not just a Black issue. White supremacy needs people of color to be divided so that they can then use us and divide us and put us against each other and do the work for them. But the moment that we join hands together is the moment that we will see change. Thank you.